International news, there is violence again in eastern Ukraine. The government and anti-government forces have been exchanging fire for the past several days in what looks to be a direct violation of the Minsk agreement. Separatist leaders claim Kiev is on the offensive, while Ukraine's president insists his army is only defending itself.
Unknown number of civilian deaths on both sides of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. At least 7 Ukrainian servicemen dead and thousands of explosions per day. This is the biggest escalation of the conflict in the east of Ukraine for almost 2 years. It's very hard to understand what's going on now and who started it. Reporting from both sides of the conflict is very one-sided, and leaders of both Ukraine and the breakaway region in Donetsk openly blame one another. Leaders of the breakaway regions blame Kiev, saying they started a creeping offensive on the anti-government parts of the country. President Poroshenko of Ukraine, speaking at the Ukraine Security Council, insisted that his troops were only defending themselves from rebel attacks.
Vladimir Putin spoke about the fighting whilst meeting the Hungarian Prime Minister in Budapest.
The Ukrainian leadership wants money. It needs money right now. And you can best get money from the European Union, from certain European countries, from the United States, from certain international financial institutions, if you portray yourself as a victim of aggression.
President of the European Union, which backs Ukraine in the conflict, called on Russia and pro-Russian separatists to turn down the heat.
The humanitarian situation in the Avdiivka region is getting critical. We are reminded again of the continued challenge posed by Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine, as well as the threat to the implementation of the Minsk agreement.
I consider it unfortunate that the occasion of my first appearance here is one in which I must condemn the aggressive actions of Russia. It is unfortunate because it is a replay of far too many instances over many years in which United States representatives have needed to do that. It should not have to be that way. We do want to better our relations with Russia. However, the dire situation in eastern Ukraine is one that demands clear and strong condemnation of Russian actions.
Ambassador Haley calls on Russia to not only stop the fighting, but also says U.S. sanctions won't be lifted until Crimea is returned to Ukraine.
Ambassador Haley, in her statement, touched on the issue of Crimea. Here we should point out that in the Constitution of the U.S., such outstanding historical words were sounding. We the people, it says. The people of Crimea voiced their will in this referendum. 93% of the population voted in favor of reunification with Russia, that Crimea was unjustifiably and illegitimately torn from.
The recent fighting there has left communities without power, water, or electricity as nighttime temperatures have fallen to 20 below 0 Celsius, creating a potential humanitarian crisis.
Now, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko plans a referendum on whether his country should join the North Atlantic Trade Organization, NATO. Poroshenko said polls suggest 54% of Ukrainians support such a move. Poroshenko said if Ukrainian people vote in favor, he will do all he can to secure Ukraine's membership in the Western Military Alliance. Any move by NATO to admit Ukraine is expected to spark tensions with Russia. NATO and Ukraine have had close relations since early 1990s. They both accuse Russia of providing troops and weapons to support pro-Russian militias in the eastern Ukraine. But Moscow has denied any involvement. NATO has recently conducted large-scale military maneuvers in Ukraine.
Ukraine is apparently moving its tanks into the town of Avdiivka in the east of the country. That's despite the area being classified as a demilitarized zone. Heavy military vehicles were filmed by a BBC war correspondent who posted a video on his Twitter account. Avdiivka, as well as neighboring Donetsk and Makiivka, have suffered severe shelling in the past few days, resulting in a number of deaths, both of soldiers and civilians. The area where Avdiivka is located is called a contact line, which marks a buffer zone of 50 kilometers. No heavy weapons are meant to be located there under the Minsk peace agreement.
Among the residential blocks and people's houses in Avdiivka, which is a small city just outside of Donetsk, it's actually right on the front lines and is part of the buffer zone, in the buffer zone, in fact. There, a BBC journalist has filmed Ukrainian troops as well as heavy armor. tanks that shouldn't be there. The BBC journalist that filmed all of this says that they're apparently ready for action.
The United States has eased sanctions on Russia's Federal Security Service. These were imposed over the alleged hacking of the U.S. presidential election.
Well, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is a section of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, has said that transactions with Russia's Federal Security Services, the FSB, are permitted at this point as long as they don't exceed $5,000, and they're done for the purposes of licensing, permits, certifications, or notifications. Now, this is an amendment to the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in the aftermath of the elections. In December of last year, the Obama administration was hurling all sorts of allegations about Russian hackers and Russian meddling, allegedly in the election, and all kinds of things. Now, the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, he chose not to call it an easing of sanctions. Let's take a listen to what exactly he said, what he chose to call it.
Not easing sanctions. The Treasury Department, it is, from what I understand, it is a fairly common practice for the Treasury Department, after sanctions are put in place, to go back and to look at whether or not there needs to be specific carve-outs for different, either industries or products and services that need to be going back and forth. But I would refer you back to the Treasury Department on that.
Now, whatever you choose to call it, the reality is this is a de facto easing of sanctions.
Turkey has accused Greece of provocative actions and warned there could be no going back if tensions were allowed to escalate. Ankara's comments come as the Greek court blocked the extradition of 8 Turkish soldiers involved in July's failed coup in Turkey. Ankara warned that relations with Greece would be reviewed. In the aftermath, Greece reported mass incursions by Turkish military aircraft over the central and southern agency. This as the two countries played an important role in efforts to contain Europe's worst refugee crisis in decades. Turkey and Greece also politically smoothed the way for negotiations between Greek and Turkish Cypriot leaders.
There are unverified reports today from the Hezbollah terror group claiming the Israeli military has been spotted crossing into Lebanon to carry out work on the other side of the border. The Iranian proxy claims its operatives witnessed bulldozers working just over the frontier between the two countries, which are in a formal state of war. Photos reportedly taken of the site captured images of soldiers and vehicles, although it's impossible to determine their nationality. Even though Israeli defense officials are refusing to comment on the allegations, the army is known to occasionally venture to the other side to conduct maintenance of the border fence. There have been several skirmishes along the frontier involving gunshots fired by terrorists belonging to the Shiite Islamist group at Israeli soldiers in the nearby northern hills of the Jewish state, which Beirut refers to as its Zionist enemy. Hezbollah frequently boasts of the extensive arsenal of hundreds of thousands of missiles that it stockpiled in the area, that are all aimed at Israel.
Now Jordan's King Abdullah has warned U.S. President Donald Trump against relocating the American embassy from Tel Aviv over Jerusalem Al-Quds. The Jordanian media said the king made the remarks in a meeting with Trump on the sidelines of that national prayer breakfast held in Washington. King Abdullah told the U.S. president the move could threaten a so-called two-state solution and have a detrimental effect on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
President Donald Trump's position on Israeli settlements appears to be changing. Thursday evening, the Jerusalem Post reported the White House told Israel to stop announcing new settlements. The Trump administration reportedly said the president was committed to a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. That would be a departure from Trump's recent talk on Israeli-Palestinian relations.
Our president has been, I think, the worst thing that's ever happened to Israel.
Before taking office, Trump tweeted, "We cannot continue to let Israel be treated with such total disdain and disrespect." He suggested things would change once he became president. But Thursday, a White House statement rang a different tone. Press Secretary Sean Spicer said, "While we don't believe the existence of settlements is an impediment to peace, the construction of new settlements or the expansion of existing settlements may not be helpful in achieving that goal." With Israel pushing for settlements in East Jerusalem, this might not be the kind of Trump administration the Israeli government was hoping for. Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are set to meet on February 15th.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to fly to London next week, where he will meet with British Prime Minister Theresa May. The meeting on Monday will be the first between the two since May took office in July. The last meeting scheduled between the two leaders was cancelled in December as part of Netanyahu's response to Britain voting in favor of UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which condemned any Israeli presence over the 1967 lines as illegal, including the Western Wall. May issued an unprecedented rebuke several days later towards U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, following his speech blaming Israel for the lack of progress in the peace process. Britain also sent a low-level diplomat to the Paris Peace Conference as an observer to indicate its displeasure with the proceedings.
President Donald Trump is creating doubts over whether he'll honor an agreement with Australia that he calls a dumb deal. Some background first. Roughly 1,200 asylum seekers, mostly from Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq, have been refused entry into Australia and instead have been kept in detention centers on other Pacific islands. Toward the end of his term, Barack Obama struck a deal with Turnbull for the U.S. to take in those asylum seekers. That's now jeopardized by Trump's recent executive order that temporarily freezes the refugee program and bans travelers from several countries, including Iraq and Iran. Turnbull spoke to Trump over the weekend, reportedly to make sure the agreement would still be honored. But according to the Washington Post, Trump accused Australia of trying to send the U.S. a new wave of, quote, Boston bombers.
The president reportedly ended a phone call with the Australian Prime Minister abruptly.
The report that the president hung up is not correct. The call ended courteously. And as far as the nature of the discussion, it was very frank and forthright.
When you hear about the tough phone calls I'm having, don't worry about it.
President Trump upset over an agreement made by President Obama to accept 1,200 refugees who are down under. The White House says the U.S. will vet the refugees before allowing them in. President Donald Trump vowed to study this, quote, dumb deal.
Donald Trump has taken a tough line against Iran in the wake of it test firing a ballistic missile. After he said nothing is off the table, sources told Reuters news agency that the U.S. is expected to impose additional sanctions on Iranian entities as early as Friday.
Well, Donald Trump made no secret of wanting to toughen the relationship, Robin, with Iran, even as a candidate, saying if the Iranians made a gesture to our sailors in the Persian Gulf, where there have definitely been provocative moves in the past, they will be shot out of the water. He said that last September, and now Iran has made a provocative move with its ballistic missile test, and they're certainly making bold moves in Iraq. So the statement by Flynn and the late-night tweet by the president should not be surprising. But what does it mean in terms of a response? The White House says they are looking at several options, as Cecilia said, and they did not rule out military options, which doesn't mean they're going to make a military move, but Iran now knows the gun is on the table.
Meanwhile, the Iranian government is now firing back at President Trump. A top advisor to Iran's supreme leader said this, and I quote, "This is not the first time that an inexperienced person has threatened Iran. The American government will understand that threatening Iran is useless." And a foreign ministry spokesman added this, and I quote, "Instead of thanking Iran for its continued fight against terrorism, the American government is practically helping the terrorists by claims about Iran that are baseless, repetitive, and provocative."
Secretary of Defense James Mattis is in Asia this morning on his first overseas trip in his new role. He will try to reassure Japan and South Korea, two of the United States' strongest allies, and he will reassure them on America's commitment to the region.
U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis arrived in Seoul on Thursday afternoon for his first overseas trip since taking office less than 2 weeks ago. While all eyes are focused on what results the talks will bring about, one expert offered his predictions.
North Korea has been enhancing its nuclear and weapons of mass destruction capabilities, and Washington wants to strongly counter those measures, which seem to be the reason why Mattis chose Seoul as a destination for his first overseas trip.
Mattis met with U.S. Forces Korea Commander Vincent Brooks and was briefed on the current security situation on the peninsula. That includes the speculation North Korea is preparing to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile. to mark the birthday of late former North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. On Friday morning, Mattis and Seoul's defense chief Han Min-gu will sit down together for the first defense minister talks between the two countries under the Trump administration.
Any attack on the United States or on our allies will be defeated, and any use of nuclear weapons would be met with a response that would be effective and overwhelming.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has said he asked China for help to stop Islamic militants attacking vessels off the south of the country. While speaking to newly promoted army generals, Duterte said he would like the Chinese Navy to dispatch a fleet, such as it did in 2009 when it sent a convoy to the Gulf of Aden to protect Chinese ships from Somali pirates. The Philippine government says militant groups are trying to establish an Islamic State-backed caliphate in Southeast Asia that would include the Philippines' southern island of Mindanao.
Despite the Secretary of the Army green-lighting construction to resume on the Dakota Access Pipeline, a group of U.S. military veterans have vowed to block completion of the hotly disputed pipeline. Anthony Diggs, a spokesman for the group Veterans Stand, said, "We are committed to the people of Standing Rock. We are committed to nonviolence, and we will do everything within our power to ensure that the environment and human life are respected. That pipeline will not get completed, not on our watch." On Tuesday, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe also vowed to mount a legal challenge, claiming that the Corps lacks the statutory authority to prevent an environmental review and issue the easement. Some suspect that the presence of veterans among protesters potentially sets up a public relations challenge for the Trump administration.
It looks like Hillary Clinton is prepared to be back in the public eye. According to the New York Post, the former Democratic presidential candidate is planning her comeback tour. The Post is reporting that Clinton is going to be on the speaking circuit again, and she's writing a children's book. The Associated Press reported that Clinton will also be writing a book featuring a compilation of personal essays inspired by the hundreds of quotations she has been collecting for decades. Clinton commented on the project saying, "These quotes have helped me celebrate the good times, laugh at the absurd times, persevere during the hard times, and deepen my appreciation of all life has to offer."
President Trump has tweeted a photo of a unique moment at the White House. It's a picture of him pausing to pray with his Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch, along with Vice President Pence and several family members. Many Christian leaders are applauding Trump for picking Judge Gorsuch. An executive order draft on religious freedom is being considered by the Trump administration. ABC News says it received a copy of the proposed order, which would protect religious rights when they clash with gay rights. It would also prevent some private companies from having to offer contraceptive coverage as part of their health plans. ABC News says it would also pave the way for tax-exempt groups to voice opinions on moral or political issues from a religious perspective without losing their tax-exempt status. The stage is being set for President Trump to follow through on one of his campaign promises to Christians, repealing the Johnson Amendment. The House is taking advantage of the election momentum, introducing not one but two bills aimed at removing the government muzzle from pastors once and for all.
Freedom of religion is a sacred right.
President Trump's vow delighted religious leaders gathered at the annual breakfast.
I will get rid of and totally destroy the Johnson Amendment and allow our representatives of faith to speak freely and without fear of retribution. I will do that, remember.
The Johnson Amendment is named after former President Lyndon Johnson, who introduced it when he was a senator in 1954. It prevents tax-exempt nonprofits, notably churches, from donating to candidates.
Opponents of the Johnson Amendment argue it allows the IRS to bully and intimidate churches. Pastors who've been targeted by the law came to D.C. to share their stories. Houston pastor Hernan Castano says the city's lesbian mayor had his sermons and text messages subpoenaed because of his outspoken stance on issues like gay marriage. Castano was given a short period of time to turn them in, or he would face imprisonment.
It caused a lot of stress on the church members, a lot of questioning, and other pastors just fled in fear because obviously they couldn't believe this was happening in America.
Pastor Castano says the law causes a lot of confusion for clergy, and many do not understand why sharing their interpretation of scriptures could lead to fines or removal of tax-exempt status.
Talking to many pastors, I've seen the intimidation, the fear, and how they would not speak out because they don't want to lose their 501c3 status.
He says each year around election time, warnings and threats are sent to the church, citing the Johnson Amendment.
Everyone should have their full freedom of speech, not partial freedom of speech, which is what we're really happening right now in the pulpits of America.
Congressman Heiss and Senator Langford agree, which is why they introduced legislation in both sides of the House to protect these pastors.
Now, I understand that there are some individuals that don't like it when churches speak out, but quite frankly, there are churches on the left and on the right politically that they should have the right. We as Americans shouldn't limit speech.
Lawmakers have high hopes 2017 will be the year it goes.
To